Hello everyone, welcome back to Good Morning KU. I'm Karsan Turner and I'm joined here with Ethan Corson. He is the new Dole Fellow at the Dole Institute of Politics for the spring 2019 semester. So thank you for coming on to the show, Ethan. It's good for you to be here. And just as a broad overview, what is a Dole Fellow and what do they do?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to be leading a spring discussion group this semester starting February 13th at 4 o'clock at the Dole Institute. And it's going to be seven seminars, and so it's going to run every Wednesday starting on February 13th at 4 o'clock at the Dole Institute, and then it's going to be 7 straight weeks other than the week that you have spring break. And so the role of the fellow is to really facilitate a discussion group on a particular topic, and so each week we're going to bring in a different guest to talk about a different aspect of the topic. And my topic is international trade in the 21st century. So we're going to be taking a look at international trade from a variety of angles with some really interesting guests. Most of the folks that we're going to be bringing in are folks that I worked with when I was at the Department of Commerce. I was part of the Secretary of Commerce's senior leadership team, and then I was Chief of Staff of the International Trade Administration at the time that the Obama administration was trying to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So there's going to be folks that I worked with who've touched on trade from a variety of different angles, some of them in working with Congress, some of them from a legal and enforcement standpoint, some of them from a policy standpoint. So we're really going to look at the issue, which I think is a really important issue, but is not always well understood by a lot of people. So we're going to look at it from several different lenses.
Okay, what are some is there a difference between free trade and international trade? Are those interchangeable terms? Or?
I think they're largely interchangeable terms that folks use when they're talking about the general view that the way I would think about the terms are just sort of the general view that the U.S. should be engaged with the rest of the world. The U.S. should be engaging in commerce with the rest of the world, because when you think about it, there's really 3 ways that the U.S. engages with the rest of the world. So the first is militarily, right? So that's something like defense arrangements that we have with other countries, alliances. The second is diplomatically, so that's the U.S. State Department, the United Nations, our system of embassies and consulates around the world. But the third way, and the one that I think is least understood, is through trade and commerce, and that's what we're really going to focus on.
And so how does free trade, international trade affect the average Kansan?
It affects us in a lot of ways, that we don't always think about. I mean, you think about the Kansas farmer who sells his or her soybeans to China and the effect that current trade policy has had on those sales. It really does impact our state's economy because, as you know, our state's economy is largely agricultural based. I mean, that makes up a significant part of the Kansas economy. So it affects us in that way. It also affects us in ways that we don't always think about, right? I mean, it's, you know, the iPhone that a lot of us have in our pockets right now is actually manufactured in China and then sent to the U.S. to be sold here. Ford Explorers that you see on the road are mostly assembled in Chicago and then sent all around the world to be sold there. So everything we do in our daily lives touches on this issue of America's role in the world and trade, but it's not always something that we always think about. It's not always top of mind. And so that's something I hope folks will get out of the discussion group, is a better understanding of trade and America's role in free trade in the world.
And so as our technology kind of advances and we kind of become more interconnected, do you think free trade is going to play a much larger role in our lives as opposed to maybe 20 years ago?
You know, I think it depends. I think one of the things that's interesting about free trade and about international trade more generally is that for decades following World War II, there was this kind of bipartisan consensus that one of the few things that both parties agreed on throughout a number of decades was that, one, that the U.S. should be the leader of the free world, that we should lead what we call the liberal international order, and that the U.S. should be at the head of that. And that part of that leadership was engaging in free trade, was engaging in commerce with other countries. This sort of idea that the U.S. could be safer if we helped make other countries safer, that the U.S. could be richer if we helped other countries be richer, that the U.S. could be more prosperous if other countries were more prosperous. And that was something that was a broad bipartisan agreement through a number of decades. But what we've seen recently is a real retreat from that. I mean, right now, one of the few issues that both major political parties agree on is that trade is now a bad thing. And so we've seen really a 180-degree turn in how we've looked at free trade historically. I mean, traditionally, like I said, it was a very bipartisan thing. I'll give you a couple examples. It was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was actually negotiated by the George H.W. Bush administration, but it was signed into law by President Clinton, who had a host of disagreements with the H.W. Bush administration on foreign policy. But one thing that he wanted to continue was to finalize that agreement. And that agreement actually was passed through Congress, so signed by a Democratic president, but passed in both the House and the Senate with more Republican votes than Democratic votes. And so that's sort of an example about how the pro-free trade view historically had been a pretty bipartisan issue, but now we've seen President Trump, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren really take a much harder line against free trade. So to answer your question, I think it's going to be very interesting to see which of those two views really sort of comes to dominate the American viewpoint going forward and becomes American policy in the decades to come.
And why do you think that is, that some people are, well, like you said, President Trump and then Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren are now kind of taking a different stance on free trade?
I think one of the challenges with free trade is that there are a lot of arguments that people use, and people say that trade has had these impacts, and that's one of the things I want to talk about in the discussion group, is to take a look at some of the arguments against free trade and really try to understand them. I mean, I really want the group to be a nonpartisan, non-ideological discussion where we can really talk about these issues. But one example is you hear people on both the left and right politically make the argument that trade has killed American manufacturing. And I think that's an argument that we should take seriously, and that's going to be kind of a topic that we're going to discuss with some of our guests. You also hear the argument that all these formerly good-paying American jobs have gone overseas, and the reason for that is free trade, right? And I think so we should look at that, but we should also consider, is that right? Or is it things like technology? Is it things like artificial intelligence that have really contributed to some of the changes in our economy that we've seen over the past decades? So I think we should take those arguments seriously, but I think we should also be open to that there may be other reasons why we've seen these changes in our economy.
Okay. Yeah, so that's kind of a good way to, compare the two differences, pro, con, and then, like you said, you're going to mainly focus on looking at those other arguments and getting an understanding. Is it technology, or is it because of these jobs that are going away? That's a very interesting take on that. And I think that's about all the time that we have. Is there any last minute things you want to say or mention about the seminar before we go to break?
Well, I think that I'm really excited for what I think is going to be a really interesting series of discussions. And one of the things about this topic is that really no matter what you're interested in, whether it's law or business or communications or working in government or public policy, this discussion group is really going to touch on all of those aspects. So I think that there's going to be something interesting in these sessions for every student, no matter what their interest. And so I'm really looking forward. Again, we're starting February 13th, and we'll go 7 weeks after that, 4 o'clock at the Dole Institute, and I hope to see a lot of students there.
And if you missed the first one, is it okay to go to the second one, or go to as many as you can?
Absolutely.
Does it go chronologically, or each one kind of its own?
Each one is going to focus on kind of a discrete topic. So we're going to talk, for example, one of the sessions we focused on working with Congress and talking with Congress about trade and how Congress right now is looking at trade agreements. One will be talking about the communications aspect of free trade. One will be talking about how we enforce trade agreements once we've entered into them. So each of them is going to take a cut at trade from a little bit of a different angle. So I think it's going to be a really interesting series.
Sounds great. And once again, Ethan, thank you for coming by to Media Crossroads, and we'll be back after the break.